English as a second language teacher and have been teaching English online now exclusively for almost 4 years. Actually, one of the reasons I'm going to share the screen with you now and just bring up the website where our content is housed. But when I'd been teaching in classrooms for a very long time and eventually decided to move online. And when I moved into a digital environment, one of the frustrations I had was to find content that I felt had been made specifically for an online digital classroom and that really was adapted for the 21st century student, i.e. it was very bright and engaging and perhaps more interactive than the textbooks. Textbooks are still obviously extremely useful, but in today's age now, I think it's very important, especially as we collaborate with our colleagues, that you create content that can actually be used with other people and by other people and across a multitude of students. Obviously, as teachers, you know, one of the biggest complaints of teachers has always been that you don't have enough time to plan your lessons. And so that was the other reason we started off the class, was to create content that could be used again and again and again. Now, obviously, no lesson that you create, whether it be in a Word format or PowerPoint format, or whichever format you choose, is going to be usable 100% of the time for 100% of students. But the idea is that you create lesson plans that really work well for, I say, 80% of students, 80% of the time. And if you're an experienced teacher, obviously then you just bring your adaptive skills into to the fore and make sure that that lesson, you know, is passable and can obviously be very, very effective. Obviously, the other good thing about creating digital content and storing it is that if it's not on paper, it's very easy to adapt that content as you go along. So once you're using your content and you use it with different students, it becomes very, very easy, A, to spot any small errors that may have lingered in the original document, but B, you can really adapt it as you go along over time. And this is something that's been hugely beneficial. Most of you will still be using textbooks. I still refer to them from time to time. As good as textbooks are, you will often find that cultural references need to be changed, and especially images. There's something about images that need to be updated. If you're using, we always use royalty-free images, and I'm going to go into that during the webinar, but you'll find that the ability to update your content makes it very, very powerful as you go along, so that you really feel, especially again, if you're collaborating and sharing your content, is that everybody is always using the most up-to-date version of the document itself. So I'm going to go in now and show you how I start. It's pretty simple. I always start with a Word document, and just let me bring that one up for you. The reason I start with a Word document is simply because that's what I feel comfortable working on. And if you have, okay, you should be able to see that now. So basically, I create lessons, and first of all, I have a naming convention. I usually create them in a category order at a time. So rather than doing individual lessons that I need to teach on a particular day, I'll sit there and think for the month, right, this month I really want to get all of my conditionals or all of my phrasal verbs, which requires a bit of planning. And as you would know, the time that you actually get to set aside to do lesson planning, it really is a good idea to try and get as much of it out of the way as possible. So when I'm thinking about creating a category of lessons, here I've done some functional and task-based lessons. I try and put a very small objective, and this can be a very kind of SOTA type thing. It doesn't have to have a lot of heavy TESOL language in it, but the idea is that you create an objective, and that's for you to refer back to. And also I'll show you that this objective also appears on teacher notes that I create as a separate document. So I put a very rough overview of how many slides that I intend. So I work with PowerPoint. So this Word document will be changed into a PowerPoint, and I'll explain that. And then each one of these slides, as I go along, I simply put in, as we get down, there's a list perhaps of the vocabulary that I'm going to do, and then I simply get into it and I make it very clear. For example, So you can see here in the top left-hand corner now, oh, I'm sorry, we've got slide 1, and there's a very quick instruction at the top that will be there for the student. And then in brackets, I will always put things that if somebody else is helping me or assisting me, this is information in parentheses that won't appear on the slide, but is an instruction to myself or somebody else to carry that information over to the slide. So here it's just a simple insertion of various images. Other times I put in here things that need to go into the teacher notes that will support the slide. And off we go again, down through. It's fairly straightforward. Slide 2, slide 3, slide 4, etc., etc. So I just do it on a Word document because I find that that is the way that most of us have learned to create documents in a very long row. And then the idea is that you are going to transfer all of that to another form. Now, there are a lot of different slide software out there now. There's Prezi, there are a whole bunch of things, the names of which escape me. I'm a little bit old school. I use PowerPoint simply because I wanted to get a start on it 4 years ago without having to learn a new system. But I know that some teachers prefer, there are a number of different slide kind of softwares out there now. PowerPoint does everything I believe that you need. And this is also one thing that I would say when you go into creating lesson content, stick with the tools that you are familiar with. Creating lessons takes so much time that I would very much say to you that when you are going to do it, steer away from all of these new apps. There is just so much that is out there now and so much that is being released. The reality is that I find Microsoft products very reliable. I know they're probably not the most user-friendly software on the block, but if that's what you're used to, stick with it, because the task ahead of you of creating content, the ability to create it, go back, review it. You may need to, as I said, collaborate or get somebody else involved on the proofreading. You want to be giving software that people are really familiar with. So if you're going to use a new type of app like Prezi, be very sure that other people, if you're going to share it with them, are very comfortable with using that software. You don't want to be training people on how to use your actual content. All right, so what I'm going to do now is just bring you back to a PowerPoint itself. And here, this is how I create the lessons. So the PowerPoint that you saw before, each one of those little items called slide 1, slide 2, you can see very easily how they translate on the left-hand side. I simply go in and transfer that information. And now I'm going to get into more about how you, obviously I'm not going to tell you what content you need to put on, but what I will tell you is how we have found over time what works well for both yourself and, more importantly, for your students to whom you're imparting that information. So the first thing I would say is crisp, clean, clear, and colorful. One of the criticisms I had about my lesson content is perhaps that it appeals more to children than to adults. I would dispute that, but I'm very big on color, but it's up to you. You will need to find a balance, but I think that color is very important, and images, as all of you would know, are very good to start a lesson with. So most of our lessons on the title slide, even you may not wish to show that to the student. You might just have it there, you know, as I believe that a title slide is important, you know, on any document. You may not wish to show that to the student. You may get straight into it, but images are very, very good way to start. So what I would say here is that you will need a very short title at the very top of the slide. Always maintain a consistent format on your slides. So you always want to provide a very short title up the top, but often I make that an instruction. And the instruction should never be something like can you or try to. It should either be an imperative, do this, or it should be a question that requires the student to answer it. And that way you get the student obviously thinking about something, or they can launch straight into the activity that's there. We've got a little bit of support language here as well. And then as you can see, every image that we put in a lesson has always got either a number or letter next to it. I only learned that after a bit of trial and error, but one of the things that we find is that students, obviously with a low level of language, may not actually be able to explain to you which image that they are looking at. They may not have, especially when it comes to at the top, at the bottom, on the right. So simply labeling everything you put in there, even if it's secondary to the exercise, is a very good way of keeping students on track, and also to extend what's going on. If the student can get into what's happening on the slide immediately, you will actually not have to run through these slides quickly, but you can develop the conversation as it goes along. This one is a functional lesson, so there's no explicit grammar explanations. Lots of images in these lessons, as I said, are a really good way to get students talking. Okay, so one of the things I said is that if you are going to collaborate with other teachers, a template is vital. So in order to find a template, create it and stick with it. Don't try and create new templates all the time. Find something that works for you and resist the urge to change it all the time. And by that, as I go along, you can see here that blue title slide appears in the same place, at the same height, it's the same width, and it uses the same font. All of those things provide a very consistent and professional image to the student. And secondly, the students become habituated in the way that the information is presented, and therefore they already know what's going to, in a sense, they can predict what's going to come next. That over time will actually reduce your teacher talk time, because it gives the power to the student and enables them to start reading the slides as they come along without having to look for where that instruction is going to be. I know that sounds like a fairly standard and perhaps not a very enlightening thing to say, but a lot of the content that we have seen from other teachers, a lot of teachers mix things up perhaps a little bit too much, and then the students get lost every time. So I would say, especially with the title and then any further supporting language or instruction, same height, same width, same position on every slide. And that's really important, because when you go to share your screen, if it's PowerPoint, people often forget as they're creating slides individually that when you go into the presentation and you're moving between slide to slide, it's only then that you really start to see how things jump around the page. And that can actually become distracting for a student in an online situation, or if you're showing your content on a whiteboard or in a classroom environment. Again, you can see here all the images are labeled, and then there are questions at the bottom. I'll just tell you now also that I create a secondary PowerPoint, which is a set of teacher notes. And that is language that I don't want, or that is information that I don't want the student to see, but is there for me as reference. And also because I share my information with other users, it can guide you as a teacher and into the questions that you need to ask for concept checking, to elicit information, and all of that is kept away from the student. So the student gets the minimum information that they need to be able to continue with the lesson, and it doesn't overload the student. And obviously you don't want them to see your notes. File naming convention. It's really important as well. I resisted this for a while, but learned the hard way. Make sure that you have some kind of unique numbering system for your lessons. Again, if you're going to be sharing, you always want a small number or a unique number that you can start to keep, because over time, you will find it's very easy to lose track of what you have done, and especially if you start to create different versions. One thing that I do is I only keep a single version of every lesson, because it's digital. Once it gets updated, that remains the version, and that anybody I share that with is using the same version. So be very wary of having different versions of the same lesson. And if you do that, make sure you really will need the unique numbering system to be able to do that. One thing I would also suggest is that in your numbering system, you might like to make sure that you have defined the level. So obviously, if you're using the CEFR levels, somewhere between A1 to C2 perhaps, and then you might like to put from beginner to advanced. Those kinds of things are also very beneficial in the title page for, again, if you're going to share the document. And what is the topic? So I normally, for example, if it's a grammar-based lesson or if it's a functional lesson, keep it short and sweet, but it should appear somewhere. I'm also just going to tell you, I'll bring you back now to, just bear with me one second. I'll bring you back now to our website. And the reason I'm going to do that is this is how our lessons appear once we have uploaded them to the site. So I'm not going to go into all of that and how we've created this system, but I've now created about 540 lessons, and we have created a system that allows other teachers to come on and use those. But what I want to show you very quickly here is how those lessons appear on the site. These are PowerPoints. Obviously, there's been a conversion. On the right-hand side is the lesson content that the student would see, and that's what I was showing you in the PowerPoint before. And here is another PowerPoint that I created. You can see here how I mentioned the objective. And then if you're creating a numbering system, what I've been able to do as well is make sure that these lessons start to become interconnected and part of a curriculum, because I can refer back to other numbers in the system, other lessons in the system, which makes it really powerful for other teachers to be able to use. So if you're working in a school environment, this works really well if you start to get people into that idea of using one system for everybody. So I'm going to close the teacher's notes just because I'm concentrating on the content today. On our system, you can flip the notes out. Title page is what the student would see. And now, again, as you go through, you can see straight away that your eyes are not moving up and down because the content is always staying, hopefully, at the same level. You can see that I'm using the same fonts, the same sizes of the fonts, and I'll go through that now very quickly. If you're using PowerPoint, the font sizes are really important. I think I've got this down to a fine art now. Titles, 38, and no less than 34. These sound like small details, but I find this is something we have perfected over time. Title in 38 to 34, stick it on one line. If it doesn't fit on one line, change your title. Remove the modal verb, change it into a question. Do whatever you can, keep it nice and neat in one line. Supporting language, anything underneath, maximum of 26, and don't go below 20. There's one exception for that, and that is reading. If you have reading texts, students can cope down to 18. Now, all of this works well. I'm talking about if you're showing on a laptop. Obviously, whiteboards are something different, but a laptop and a tablet, students will struggle with 18 on a mobile phone. It's very difficult to produce great content. You know, you would have to have very little text on any slide for a student on a mobile phone, but 18 is about the minimum to which I would go on the slides there. Images, as I said, we tend to put them on every single slide that we have. It should support in case the student doesn't understand, and it can also act as a prompt for vocabulary. So if you use a difficult piece in vocabulary, always think about perhaps putting in an image that actually shows that. So different types of information that you want to present. Sometimes you're doing an explicit grammar, piece of explicit grammar. Sometimes you're doing a graphical representation. Here, clines, timelines, presentations of tenses. I tend to keep the grammar lessons quite monochromatic. I find that too much color in those tends to perhaps disorientate the student a little bit. So I tend to use monochromatic and then different shades within that for grammar explanations. Grammar slides, nice and clear, and then you come into these kind of gap fill activities. Always remember that if you're going to collaborate, these days people are using online such as Zoom or Skype, and most things, including our own system of the class, now come with annotation tools. So always think about perhaps using the that teaches well, actually, and that's another reason for keeping text to a minimum, is that you want to allow people, if they need to draw onto the onto the slides. You can also, then be drawing arrows. You can use the sides here perhaps to explain some vocabulary without speaking. So always remember, keeping the information to a minimum really allows you to use annotation tools that are provided now with a lot of the different displays. So this is a one that I've done on conditionals. I'll just go through. Matching activities work particularly well online, so I advise, they're a really good thing, a controlled activity. You can, do the matching with the annotations. I don't know if I've done that correctly. And then, of course, you can adapt from that. So once you've done that, then it's very easy to ask the student, oh, can you replace the if clause here? I'm sorry, they're not if clauses, sorry. If you could replace the if clause here with something else. So you really start to get into a freer practice, and the student really, you don't have to just do the exercise online. The idea is that you are adaptive. You put enough material on to get started, but then you let the lesson take its natural flow. I'll go into another style of lesson that we've got. This is one on phrasal verbs. Again, it's monochromatic, images to support where I can the phrasal verbs, and then going into something here. I do a maximum generally of 4 to 5 exercises per slide. I find that that's probably enough, or the students start to feel that they're doing it over and over again. You can, of course, do successive slides with the same type of activity, but even just having a limiting the amount of information on the slide allows students to feel as though they've accomplished something before they move on to the next slide. Again, another 4 here. There'll probably be gap fills somewhere. Go through. There we go. We've got gap fills. Gap fills obviously work very well, particularly with this type of activity. You can then get the student to change that gap fill into the past tense. And then if you're good at adapting, you might want to see if there's another phrasal verb or another verb that would fit into that sentence. So not just doing the gap fill as it's shown there, but moving on and getting more out of that. I'll go into also another type of lesson plan that we do. This is a listening one. These tend to be based that we've done so far. The ones I've created have been at the beginner and elementary, perhaps pre-intermediate level. And if you are using PowerPoint, you can actually insert audio into that PowerPoint. I'm not going to go through creating audio today with you, but you can actually do that. Again, here we go. It's almost monochromatic, this one. And I'm just going to go into 2 things now. The first one is, I've mentioned several times that images are extremely important. But then again, you don't want to be using images that are not royalty free. And although Google is great for searching, allowing you to search royalty free images or images that can be used and modified for commercial purposes, I think is the search. You can avoid all of that these days by simply going into a site like Pixabay. So it's pixabay.com. It's saying online here, 720,000. You can't find everything, but for my purposes, it is simply the best image bank that is royalty free. You can use these images in any way you like. Most of them, 90% of them, are very high quality, so you can expand them to whatever size you need. You can crop them however you want. You will struggle to find images perhaps with to do with abstract nouns, but on the whole, anything you put in there will come out. There we go, mountain climber. So anything you put in there will literally come up with scores of images for you to use. And as I said, all of them are royalty free. So it's a really good idea to use Pixabay. I use it for almost all of my lessons now. I will also tell you, I also suggested that you want to be using color. Now, I'm not the world's best when it comes to selecting colors, so I've gone into a great site, which is called, you can see it at the top here. It's an Adobe site, and it lists all of the Pantone colors. On this site, other users have created a series of palettes, and this is a great thing for you to go into. Oh, sorry, bear with me a second. So you can go in and you can select a palette that will actually work for your lessons. And I actually use these, or have used these in the past. What you need to know is, hopefully I'll give you a little bit of information here. You're going to be presenting information, so you have to have a color that is white or whitish within that. Too much black text on a dark color is difficult for students to read, as is white, too much white on a very dark color. So something like this one here, for example, and you can click on info. This will actually work very well, because what you can use is you can use the cream as your background base, and then all of these colors will work as highlighters, whether you're putting arrows on, or your title would look great in orange or green at the top, but you're using this color here as your background. Now, of course, the question is, how do you put these colors into a PowerPoint? PowerPoint is great for this. It really allows you to take in all of these beautiful Pantone colors. There's another step that you need to do. So what you need to do here is, as you put your mouse over the color, it will bring up a series of letters and numbers for you. And I've actually forgot, I think this is called the hex system. I've forgotten off the top of my head, but I'm just gonna write down 9A, BF48. And I now want to reproduce this into PowerPoint. So if you've got that number down, what I'm going to do now is come back very quickly to PowerPoint. All right, I'm going to click on the shape. I'll go up to color, and you simply come down to more colors. When you go into more colors, oh, I'm sorry, I've missed a step. Sorry, excuse me. I need to go back to, sorry, there's one further step I forgot to put in. All right, so you're back here and you've got that. You need to convert this number into what they call an RGB. And there's another site. If you simply Google Pantone to RGB, okay, it will bring up, there are many different converters. It's almost like a currency converter. You can simply put that out. I'm going to put in 9ABF48, and you can see it's brought up already that green. You click on go. There we go. And now, further down on the page, you can see the conversion that has happened, and the RGB has given you three numbers: 154, 191, 72. I'll see if I can just, all right, so you can see there, RGB 154, 191, 72. You need to write that number down unless you have an excellent memory. Now we go back to the PowerPoint. Okay, and I go into custom, so I'll do that again. You click on a shape, you go into more colors, you click on custom, and I'm going to put these numbers in here now. So we've got 154, 191, oops, sorry. There we go, and we've got the green. You can see that it's appeared there. I click on OK, and you can see that it has now changed the text into that color. The really good thing is, I know that seemed like a lot of steps, but that color will now appear permanently in recent colors in your color palette. So once you've put the 3 or 4 colors into your template that you need, you can use them as often as you want. You just go in and select it from recent colors, and that will always work when you open that series of PowerPoint. So those colors get stored in there. So again, it's really good to use colors, and if you're not like me, very intuitive with them, and also colors, you know, go through that. There are fashions for colors. So that site that I showed you, the Adobe Pantone site, has really got other designers on there, and there are literally several hundred of those palettes for you to choose from. Okay, so once you've got your color and you've got your font size, most of you have probably realized that I'm quite boring. I use Arial. The reason I do this is when we collaborate with other people, you want to make sure that the fonts that you use are going to be usable on every computer, whether they're Macs or PCs. So be very careful about using other fonts. Not very careful. I use Arial because it's just so widely used. It's been around for a long time. People feel very comfortable with it. Be very careful about using these more hand-scripted ones. Obviously, with titles, it's good to change it, mix it up every now and then. But Times New Roman and Arial obviously work very well from the student perspective. Just even Calibri, Verdana, but remember, some of these are Microsoft fonts and they won't transfer well if you do change them or give them to a Mac user. When they'll open up their PowerPoint, you might find that the fonts revert to something else, and then perhaps some of your formatting goes out of shape. So again, choose a font and stick with it. I've done the colors. Then I was going to say, I've spoken about the images and the slide types. What I will go back to next. Oops. Okay, I'll just go back to, and I'll come back to one of the functional ones. And you can see here, I've chosen a series of colors to use, and I've stuck with them the whole way through. I think there's 5 in this palette, and I've used all of them. And some of them work. I've used white here, which is the only series in which I've used white, actually, I think, but sometimes black. Lots of images again, and going through, making sure you can see here that we've got text. I'm using bold sometimes. One thing about text is I said to you, don't go under 18, but also I limit the amount of text. And I'll just bring up a reading lesson here. I try to limit the text in a reading lesson to about a maximum of 130 lessons per slide. Now here, I've actually used a different font, but I found that this hasn't always worked for us. So I've reverted back to Arial with newer lessons that I've done, but here I have actually used a different one. So about 130 to 140 words is the maximum amount of text that I would present for anyone who's sitting under the advanced level, especially if you're going to be displaying the text on a smaller screen, such as a laptop. That's what I would look at there. So I think, Kris, that's about the majority of what I wanted to go through this morning. I think I'm going to hand this back to you, and you can perhaps answer any questions. So just let me mute the microphone. Okay, and over.
Okay, thanks for that, James. That was actually a fantastic presentation. I'm going to start, so as just a reminder to everybody today that you can post questions using the QA button. You should see a Q&A button in the top left of your screen, and you can post questions there today. There were a couple questions that came up during this session that I didn't fully cover, or that I didn't feel got fully covered during the session. So Lori Ann was actually asking a little bit about kind of the context of what she's seeing today. What's the difference between off to class? What's the difference between Zoom and so forth? So I'll add a little bit of that context right now. So for everybody that doesn't know, Off to Class is a website that myself and James work on. I'm showing you Off to Class right now. James was showing us Off to Class throughout the presentation. And Off to Class provides a content library with over 550 English as a second language lessons. I'm on the lesson library right now. And each of these lessons also come with homework, and there's a placement test and a student management system. We have teachers using Off to Class in all sorts of digital environments. So not just teaching online, people that are using their laptops to tutor in person, people that are using tablets at their students' homes, people that are teaching in classrooms and projecting on screens, if your classrooms are equipped with IWBs or TV screens. So OftaClass is used in all sorts of digital environments, including online lessons. So from an online lesson perspective, we have teachers that are using us with Skype, with Google Hangouts, with WizIQ, with Join.me, with GoToMeeting, and with Zoom.us. Zoom.us happens to be our favorite video conferencing software. We recommend it all the time. We're not associated with them. And Zoom.us happens to be the video conferencing software that we're using for today's webinar as well. So that's just to give you a bit of a context. So if you're using OftaClass for an online lesson, you just use the share screen function of whatever system you're using. So I'm sharing my screen with you guys right now, and I'm going to launch a lesson. And here, I'll just say I'm just browsing. So now here are the lessons that James was showing you. You've got the lesson content on the right, teacher notes on the left. This is the content that James was showing you that he first creates in a Word document. Then he takes that Word document, translates it to a visual representation. That's when James was getting into the PowerPoint versus Prezi. He takes that and puts it into a slide kind of context, and then that comes on to the OftaClass website. Now, the purpose of today's webinar was James wanted to show you his tricks for how he creates content. So because he's got a lot of experience of creating this beautiful visual content for OftaClass, James wanted to show you how he creates content, and maybe you could take some of his tricks and his techniques and incorporate that into your own content making. So that was just one of the questions that we had from Lorianne, and I hope I did a great job of answering it there. Okay. Zainab is asking if if the participants today get access to the presentation later. Yes, I forgot to mention that at the start. There's no need to take extensive notes. We are recording today's session, and give us about 24 hours to get it up onto YouTube, and then I'll be sending out an email to everybody that signed up for today's webinar with a recording on YouTube, so you can rewatch this presentation. And you can feel free to send it out to colleagues, anybody else who wasn't able to actually attend today. Okay, Leanne Garza is asking, how do you allow groups of students to answer or ask questions during the online lesson? How does this work in general? Okay, so the concept here, so we'll continue on from my last answer. So pretend that you are all my students right now, and we're in an online lesson. So the first step I have to do if I'm using OftaClass is I need to hide the teacher notes. The teacher notes are the secondary document that come with each of our presentations. Now, they coach our teachers on how to teach the content, but you don't want your students seeing the teacher notes. So the way I hide the teacher notes is I press this full screen button in the top right here. When I do that, the teacher notes pop up. And I'm just going to make a bit of space for them. Now I can see the teacher notes while they're hidden from you. Now the way you would use this is we've designed our content to follow the communicative approach. So what that means is students will orally be answering questions, and you'll be eliciting the target language from your students using an oral or communicative approach. So in this context, you could read out the question as the teacher, or you could have one of the students in your classroom read out the questions, and you would use these questions to elicit answers from your students. And if you had a group of students, you could actually get a conversation flowing, and you're just the monitor. So you're trying to, we've designed these to reduce the amount of speaking at all costs by the teacher, and you use these slides effectively to get your students speaking. And this also goes, so this is this is a speaking activity, so this obviously has speaking prompts. But you can also use the different tools here to work the content so that things stay fresh. So in the top right here, I've got a pen, a text tool, and a magnifying glass. I can draw on the screen using these tools to really get the flow going of the lesson. I can use the magnifying glass to zoom in on different parts of the content. I can use my text tool to actually type on the screen. This is me typing. And in that sense, this is what we mean by adaptive content. It's really designed, it provides the base of the lesson, but you as the teacher can take that base and adapt it to how your students are reacting to it. So, I mean, you have down here, you can use our preview. This is kind of like a Netflix preview style. You can jump to different parts of the content. Of course, you have to be a little bit familiar with the lesson, but you can jump to different parts of the content depending on how your students are reacting there and then to the content. And you can use, if you're teaching a group lesson, you can ask for different examples from your students. You can have all your students draw out examples from their own lives and try to personalize the content to your students, to their context. I hope that answers your question again. Leanne's asking if you can edit the content. Very soon you will be able to edit the content. We're working on that right now, and we should have a very nice release for you within the next 4 weeks, so stay tuned. A question from Sylvia. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking, but I've got a question here from Sylvia saying some comments and clues on advanced and business students. So in our lesson library, so I believe Sylvia is asking whether we have content for business students and for advanced students. So I'm back in our lesson library of Off to Class, and you'll notice under the search bar that I've actually got some level filters, and they're blue level filter buttons. And I can press on these buttons to filter our library. So if you have advanced students, you could select advanced, and now only the advanced lessons from our library are being reflected back to you. Likewise, if you had either pre-intermediate or intermediate, you could select pre-intermediate or intermediate, and now only the pre-intermediate and intermediate lessons are being reflected back to you. And we have a large business English series down here. There's 25 lessons that you can use, and those are all generally at the upper intermediate and advanced level. So we've got a huge category of business English lessons there. So I hope that answers your question, Sylvia. Natasha is asking about joining Off to Class. So no, so for joining Off to Class, you can go to offtoclass.com and you can set up a free trial account, and that will give you access to the lesson content and the homework system for 30 days for free. And after that, you need to subscribe. So it's a subscription-based service, and you can find out all about that at offtoclass.com. And that seems to be the backfill of questions there. Does anybody have any other questions? Oh, Sylvia is asking for a comparison between different video conferencing systems. So Skype versus Google Hangouts versus Zoom. It really comes down to personal choice. You really have to go in and test them yourself and see what you're comfortable with. One of the nice advantages of Skype is that your students already have it. So most likely it's already installed on their desktops. So that's a nice feature. But generally, on a performance basis, we recommend using Zoom. It handles poor or weak internet connections extremely well. It doesn't crash like Skype does when the internet connection weakens, and you can record the lessons. And it's also has very clear audio and video. So Sylvia, we'd recommend trying out Zoom.us. The basic accounts are free, so you can for one-on-one lessons, the basic accounts are free. Thomas is asking how OptiClass would work with groups. So this really depends on how you're teaching. If let's say that we're teaching online right now, Thomas, and that I'm teaching a group of students right now, so that means that I've launched a lesson in Zoom, or I've started a video call in Skype, and I have multiple students have joined my video call, and then I'm going to launch a lesson on OptiClass. Again, I'm screen sharing. So all my students are seeing my screen right now. I'm launching a lesson, and the system asks me who I'm teaching today. So I can enroll one student today. So I've enrolled Carlos. I'm in the lesson, and Carlos, as you can see down here, Carlos is enrolled in my class. If I was teaching more than one student, then I could just add students to the classroom by pressing this Enroll Students button, this orange Enroll Students button, and I can enroll as many students as I'd like into the classroom. So I'm going to enroll Chin, and now I've got Chin and Carlos are enrolled in the classroom. So what that means is that on the back end, we're going to record the fact that we've both taught Chin and Carlos, and we're going to have the option to send both Chin and Carlos the homework at the end of the lesson. And from the actual mechanics of running the class with a group lesson, there's no real limit. It really depends on how comfortable you are in managing multiple students in an online classroom. We have, sorry, I'm just trying to clear some of the questions in here. Okay, we have, I think Leanne was asking on, can you install Zoom on a mobile phone? Absolutely, yes, you can. So Zoom works on desktop, but it also works on Android and iOS. And they have apps that you can install so that your students can join. All they need to join the lesson is a link. You'll be sending them each a unique link. And if they press that link on a mobile phone, that will automatically open up their app, their Zoom app. Lori's asking about repeating the website that converts color to, that converts hex to RGB. So there's many different hex to RGB converters. All you need to do is type into to Google RGB to hex converter, and you'll find one of the converters there. And actually, newer versions of PowerPoint allow you to put in hex codes directly into the color palette, so you wouldn't even need to run that conversion. Like the version I'm using on Mac actually accepts hex codes, so you don't even need to do that RGB to hex conversion. Jason is asking, whether he can share our lesson content with his students. Well, absolutely. We already have an ability built into OptiClass for you to share your lessons with your students. So what I mean is, every time you enroll your students to one of our lessons, what we do is we automatically send them a copy of what we call a lesson summary. So you wouldn't, so let me just log into OptiClass from the student's perspective to show you exactly what I mean. So your students between classes would be logging into OptiClass. The same place you go to log into OptiClass. And when they do that, every time you've enrolled them in a lesson, they get what we call a lesson summary. So this is OptiClass from the student's perspective. They've got their homework assignments at the top, their completed homework at the bottom, and their lesson summaries at the bottom right. And every time you enroll your student in a lesson, they actually get delivered a copy of what we call the lesson summary. So these are the summary slides from the lesson. So there's no need to create teacher accounts for your students. When you bring your students onto OptiClass, we do that for you. We populate their student view for you. So I hope that answers your question, Jason. Lori's asking some question here about our lesson content. So James, who is presenting you today, is the head of content for OptiClass. So they are the sole property of OptiClass. They are when you subscribe to OptiClass, you are buying a license to use them with your students. That you are not legally allowed to download them or resell them or anything like that. They're for use as a software tool in OptiClass. We are working on a functionality where you'd be able to modify them, but you'd be modifying them within OptiClass. So you'd be modifying your own copy. So I hope that answers your question there, Lori, about the lessons on OptiClass. So we are coming to the end here. Thank you very much for all your questions. That was extremely great Q&A. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to draw out the Q&A on our webinars, and it makes it much easier when there's healthy conversation. I think we're done answering all the questions, so I'm going to sign out now. One thing I would just like to mention to everybody is that if you haven't yet signed up for your free trial account for OptiClass, you can do so at opticlass.com. And when you go to opticlass.com, you'll see this sign up form. It only takes a couple seconds to set up your account, and you'll have 30 days to try us out and to try out our library for free. And you can then have a much deeper look at the tool we've been showing you today. So that's great. So we will sign off now, and thank you to everybody for participating. And stay tuned. You can like us at facebook.com/OptiClass to stay up to date of our next webinar announcements. So signing off now, and we hope everybody has a great day. Take care.